Cruel, unusual, and agonizingly humiliating. These are the most brutal punishments in history. What's the worst thing that can happen to you today if you broke the law? A fine? Jail time? Now let's rewind a couple thousand years. How about being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes? Or having molten gold poured down your throat? These weren't just idle threats, but real punishments in the ancient world. It's hard to imagine, but these harsh punishments were once seen as vital for keeping society in check. Without them, people believed chaos would reign. But why go to such extremes? We'll explore the twisted truth of what history called justice, and by the end of it, you'll almost certainly be grateful for modern justice, and maybe question if we've really come as far as we think. But before we get started, I want to warn you that you might find the following video disturbing, as it will detail some very, very awful ways to die. So if you're squeamish, you might skip this episode. But either way, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We'll start in ancient Persia. What if I told you there was once a punishment that turned the human body into a living beehive? It sounds like something out of a horror movie or Resident Evil game, but for some unfortunate souls in ancient times, this nightmarish scenario was all too real. Welcome to the world of ancient punishments, where creativity and cruelty often went hand in hand. One of the most infamous methods from Persia was scaphism, also known as the boats. Imagine being trapped between two boats, smeared with milk and honey, and left to the mercy of the elements. But it doesn't stop there. You'd be force-fed a mixture that caused severe diarrhea, attracting swarms of insects that would slowly eat away at your flesh. It was a drawn-out, agonizing death that could last for days or even weeks. The condemned would suffer from exposure, starvation, and septic shock, all while being devoured alive. But the Persians weren't alone in their brutal ingenuity. The ancient Romans had their own horrific methods, like crucifixion. We've all heard of it, but the reality was far worse than most people realize. Victims were nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to hang, sometimes for days, until they died from exhaustion, dehydration, or asphyxiation. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals, particularly rebels, slaves, and those who challenged Roman authority. The process was slow, agonizing, and deliberately public, a gruesome reminder to anyone considering defiance. In India and Persia, execution by elephant was a popular form of capital punishment. Trained elephants were used to crush the heads or limbs of those condemned to die. In some cases, the elephants were trained to prolong the suffering, tearing apart the victim piece by piece. This method wasn't just brutal, it was a demonstration of the ruler's power over life, death, and even nature itself. Even if it was quick, the psychological terror leading up to the moment must have been unimaginable. The Vikings, not to be outdone, came up with the blood eagle. This gruesome execution involved cutting open the victim's back, breaking their ribs, and pulling their lungs out to form wings. There's debate whether this was actually practiced or just a myth, but the mere idea of it was enough to strike fear in people's hearts. Now, the ancient Greeks seem to have had an obsession with climbing inside of animal effigies. Though far from the famous Trojan horse, this method of execution is the terrifying invention of the brazen bull. Designed by the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum, this hollow bronze statue was more than just a method of execution. It was a device of pure sadism. The condemned would be locked inside the bull, and a fire would be lit underneath. As the victim roasted alive, their screams would echo through the bull's pipes, making it sound as if the bull itself was roaring. Phalaris intended to create both terror and spectacle, and in doing so, he crafted one of history's most nightmarish punishments. In China, one of the most excruciating punishments ever devised was Ling Qi, known as death by 1,000 cuts. This method, used from the 10th century all the way up until the early 20th century, was designed to inflict as much pain and humiliation as possible. The condemned was tied to a post, while small pieces of flesh were slowly cut away, leading to a drawn-out and agonizing death. Ling Qi was reserved for those guilty of the most severe crimes, such as treason or parricide, the murder of one's parent. Our next punishment takes us back to ancient Assyria, where flaying was a feared method of execution. Imagine the horror of having your skin peeled off while you were still alive. Flaying wasn't just a punishment, it was a form of psychological warfare. Used by various cultures, including the Assyrians and the Aztecs, flaying was reserved for the most serious offenses, like treason or sacrilege. The process was excruciatingly slow, often resulting in death from shock or infection. For the Assyrians, it was a way to instill terror in their enemies. Skins of the flayed were sometimes displayed on city walls as a gruesome warning. Flaying wasn't just about killing. It was about making an example, ensuring that the sight of your suffering would deter others from following in your footsteps. Next, we move to medieval Europe, where the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a favored method of execution. It was as much about spectacle as it was about suffering. The condemned would be tied to a large wheel, and their limbs were systematically shattered with a heavy iron bar. The wheel was then hoisted up onto a pole, and the victim was left to die slowly, sometimes over the course of days, exposed to the elements and public humiliation. This method was designed to prolong agony, making the victim's death an extended and brutal affair. The breaking wheel was a clear message from medieval authorities: defy the law, and you will suffer in ways unimaginable. Also from the medieval era, we dive into a particularly terrifying method of torture that played on a primal fear: rats. Rat torture involved placing a metal container filled with rats on a victim's stomach or chest, then heating it from the outside. As the metal heated up, the rats, desperate to escape, would burrow through the flesh of the victim. The pain was unimaginable, and the pure psychological terror added an extra layer of cruelty to this method. Our final punishment takes us to a more modern time, but an equally brutal punishment on the high seas. Keelhauling was a punishment inflicted on sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries, often by pirates or naval commanders. The condemned was tied to a rope and dragged under the keel of a ship, scraping its barnacles in sharp wood. The victim would be pulled from one side of the ship to the other, suffering deep cuts, drowning, or sometimes both. The salt water would intensify the pain, making the punishment even more excruciating. If the victim survived the first pass, they might be keel-hauled again, or left to bleed out in the salty sea air. Keel-hauling was a maritime punishment that served as a terrifying reminder of the harsh discipline of life at sea. It was brutal, unforgiving, and it was all too common in the lawless waters of the time. Now, these punishments weren't just about inflicting pain. They were designed to be public spectacles, warnings to anyone who might think about breaking the law. The ancient world was often a chaotic place, and rulers believed that extreme measures were necessary to maintain order. But here's the twist: these brutal methods often backfired. Instead of deterring crime, they sometimes created martyrs or incited rebellion. Take crucifixion, for example. It was meant to be the ultimate humiliation, but for early Christians, it became a powerful symbol of their faith. While the ancients believed harsh punishments maintained order, history tells a different story. Crime persisted despite increasingly cruel methods, which eventually led to a reform of criminal punishment in the 18th century. I'll cover that in a future video. So what can we learn from this brutal walk through history? Well, for starters, it's a stark reminder of how far we've come. Our justice system today, while far from perfect, is leagues ahead of the torture chambers and public executions of the past. But what do you think? Should we bring back some of the ancient punishments of the past? Or will future societies look back at us today and think we're just as barbarous? Thanks for watching this episode of Ancient Order. If you have a period of history or region whose crime, punishment, and policing you'd like me to cover, drop it in the comments and I'll consider it for a future video.